there was at least one unanswered question that came before lunch, and let's start with that.
About the Renaissance, I heard some reference to the Renaissance coming sometime after Dante, but it always seemed to me that the 1200s, the 13th century, was the flowering of the Renaissance. We had universities, Gothic architecture, beautiful paintings and stained glass windows, magnificent organs, and revivals of Greek and Roman literature. Please comment. When is the Renaissance? When was it?
Well, I don't think it's now, but yeah. But it's a really interesting question because the fundamental problem is that the folks who came along in the 15th century got to name themselves. And what's worse than that, they got to name the people who came before them. And so they took certain characteristics and applied it to themselves, and they took certain things that they didn't like and applied it to the folks who came earlier. And so one problem with that is that history texts have tended to go along with that and bought the notion that up until the time of the Renaissance, let's say up until the time of the 15th century, folks were essentially uninterested in the classical world that the Renaissance is rebirthing. And as you rightly point out in the way you phrase the question, the 13th century is a century which is essentially supersaturated with its classical past being used in a very self-conscious way. You have, for example, just sort of piggybacking on what you said, the revival of Aristotle in the universities. You have a kind of Platonism still continuing and going along side by side with that Aristotelianism. If you want to jump into the 14th century, you have somebody like Dante, who is as knowledgeable in the Latin classics as it's possible to be, and certainly as knowledgeable as his Renaissance friends another century down the line. So the problem is who gets to do the naming. And I think that the Middle Ages has suffered for a long time because of cliches that are sort of mouthed by folks who essentially got to do the publicity. It's not so much how you live during the time, but who gets to conduct the post-game interview. And it seems to me that looked at from that particular point of view, the Renaissance, narrowly named, turns out to be a continuation moving in slightly new directions, so that there were new classical texts that were discovered. There were some literary interests that were not present in the earlier time, but in a sense, it's a continuation of this larger notion of including classical and biblical culture together in a meaningful synthesis. And that had been going on certainly since the middle of the 12th century, and one could argue really that it never ever died out. So those of us who are fanatical about the Middle Ages, perhaps go too far in the other extreme and sort of consider the Renaissance as just a little blip on the radar screen. But it seems to me that it's got to become our turn sooner or later, where we get to do the naming, and that hasn't happened yet.
Let me give you a couple complimentary comments to go along with that. About 25 years ago, a medievalist at Yale did a study. This was before he could really use computers. He did a study of the way the word medieval appeared in popular literature, magazines and newspapers and whatever. My recollection was a famous cartoon that came out in 1979 where the Ayatollah Khomeini is standing at a crossroads and one arrow points forward and the other points back to the Middle Ages. Okay? That in fact medieval has come in common parlance often to mean not much more than crude or barbaric. And one of the points that this scholar, Fred Robinson, made was, of course that's annoying to medievalists, but it also has a very serious point. And he took, for example, a description that was written of some torture that took place in Paraguay. And the torture was described in incredible detail. It was all about electrodes and all this sort of stuff, doing horrible things, and it was described as medieval. And of course, the point Robinson wanted to make is it's actually modern. It's important we make that distinction, because if we call it medieval and allow us to get by with calling it medieval, first of all, we're wrong about the Middle Ages, but more than that, we're wrong about modernity. What it says is, this is not something that belongs in the 20th century. This is just sort of odd, atavistic behavior that we don't have to take very seriously. And so his point was, it does discredit to both the Middle Ages and modernity to equate the term Middle Ages or medieval with simply being crude, barbaric, and primitive.
We had a wonderful example of this sort of thing. A couple years ago, we were at lunch with our president, who was at the time an extremely sharp lady, and a good friend. She's still a star, but she's not our president anymore. She decided that she needed the big time. She's now president of the University of Nevada at Las Vegas, and that's a kind of interesting job. But anyhow, she was talking about something that essentially was bugging her, and she said, why, it's positively medieval. Cook and I, at opposite ends of the table, leapt up at the same time and started screaming at her. And we finally got her to say, from now on, when you do that, use something like Neanderthal. Now the anthropologists are mad at her, but that's not my problem. But again, this was a very enlightened person, and a person who was certainly extraordinarily supportive of the stuff that we do, and just to sort of see how ingrained it is, and of course how ingrained our reflex was at the same time. So we are, of course, very, very conscious of that, and it works in all kinds of interesting ways. I mean, part of the problem is that very frequently, if you look to certain things that happen in the Renaissance as being the culmination of something, then everything that comes before it turns out to be good only insofar as it anticipates what it's leading toward. And in one of the things that's a real interest of ours, and has been an interest of ours for many decades, the art of the Middle Ages, especially as that manifests itself in Italy, you read art history textbooks and they buy into the notion that this was really good because a little later some folks are going to come along who are even better. And the problem with that is that you fail to look at the unique aesthetic of the artwork that you're actually taking a look at. And from our point of view, let's just take, for example, Siena, which is the place that we know best, the art that they produced in the 14th century there with their biggies, with Duccio and Simone Martini and Ambrogio Lorenzetti and Pietro Lorenzetti. We would match those four guys against any four guys, any time, any place. But they get a little paragraph in the art history textbooks because the story of art history, A, was written by Florentines, and B, said that all of this is going to show how Giotto started it and it culminated in Michelangelo. Well, to those of us who think that Giotto's Arena Chapel frescoes are a lot nicer than Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel frescoes, them's fighting words, okay? And more than that, it means that this large, wonderful body of stuff is largely unknown, or perhaps even worse, known for wrong reasons, as a contrast, as a style that never got any place, rather than looking at it in terms of its own extraordinarily sophisticated aesthetic.
Let me try one more angle on this question, because I can't resist it as a historian. As I'm sure many of you know, the sort of classic work about the Renaissance was published in 1860 by Jakob Burkhardt, famous Swiss historian. And he makes what are now sort of the conventional argument, the discoverer of classical antiquity, the rise of the individual, all this sort of stuff. And you can go to Barnes & Noble today, and you'll still find 3 different translations of Burkhardt, which reminds you, it is a great work of history in some ways. It just happened to be wrong. I don't want to hold it against it, but what happens is that in the 20th century, really beginning in 1927, there's what sometimes scholars call the revolt of the medievalists. And in 1927, Charles Homer Haskins published a book with the absurd title, the oxymoronic title to many people, called The Renaissance of the 12th Century. Well, somehow they got it wrong. It was the 15th century, but At any rate, what he argued is, if you're going to talk about the revival of classical antiquity, both literally the discovery of new things, in this case Aristotle in the 12th century, and the new uses to which classical antiquity was put, then the 12th century every bit as much deserves the term Renaissance as the 15th century. And then in the 1970s, a British scholar named Colin Morris came along and he wrote a book called The Rise of the Individual. Okay, once again, you assume this is a work of Renaissance history, except the dates on it are 1050 to 1200. And he argues, really, that if we're going to be looking for this concept of the individual, which he claims you find in a lot of the Romantic literature of the 12th century and whatever, you've got to look way before the time that Burkhardt puts The Rise of the Individual. Here's my symbol of why Burkhardt's wrong. Burkhardt has a chapter in his book on the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, who died in 1250. Okay? He's in hell, by the way, in case you're interested. Dante's got a place for him, right there with Farinata, in fact, they're neighbors. But at any rate, he looks at Frederick II and said, Frederick II wasn't a really passionate Catholic. He had a harem. He had experimental science in Palermo. He's a Renaissance guy before his time. Rather than saying, maybe I'm reading the Middle Ages too narrowly, his response is he's got to be a Renaissance guy before his time. He lived out of his own time, almost out of his own body, the way Burkhardt tells the story. And I think that's the mentality we get in. When you discover something in the Middle Ages that seems to be like or anticipate the Italian Renaissance, it's either out of its time mode or it's simply seen as a predecessor for when finally it caught on more broadly. And those are I think, fairly wrong-headed ways to read what happens in Italy from, let's say, 1100 to 1500.
And again, if you're sort of pushing along those lines, what I would like to do is sort of line up all of these folks and say, well, okay, show me that work of the Renaissance again, which is the equal of the Divine Comedy, or Short Cathedral, or any number of favorites that I have. And it seems to me, while they did some good stuff, their best ain't as good as our best. And it's almost as though that stuff is, again, in that Burkhardian sense, ignored, as though somehow, yes, it was there, but it was atypical and had nothing to do with the dark superstition that everybody else lived under. Also ignoring, of course, the fact that a lot of the stuff that we associate with that dark superstition came later, like witch hunts. That was a 17th century thing. Or any number of other sort of popular heresies and superstitions that developed any time between the Renaissance and, let's say, 2004. And so it's sort of like you know the conclusion in advance, you make the evidence fit, but it seems to me it's like trying to find a couple more epicycles in the Ptolemaic system. At a certain point, the evidence is going to sort of revolt.
Well, given what we've just been talking about, how would Dante then fit into this schematic? I learned that he's on the cusp of something.
Yeah, I would say that the reason you learned that was because the people who taught it to you didn't want to come down and sort of say Dante is the epitome of medieval civilization, because that would sort of give him, that would take away his luster as a pre-Renaissance figure. Now,
he was a Catholic in the medievals. I mean,
yeah, oh yeah,
in a very Catholic sense.
Yeah.
But what he created was something radically new, and that he was the center of his journey as an individual in relationship to God, in relationship to love, in relationship to his place in his life. Was a different kind of perspective than
again, I would argue that what Dante is doing is, in that regard, nothing new, because Augustine had done it already.
But in poetry, in a vernacular, in a true...
Well, in the vernacular of his own time. No, again, not denying the huge amount of originality that Dante deserves. I think it's important to see where you locate that. I quite agree. And that what Dante is saying is we're going to marshal the resources that are there for something that is a very gutsy new enterprise, but it's that wonderful notion of new as also being aware of its traditions in a more self-conscious way and sort of incorporating more of that tradition in. And one of the things that makes Dante so wonderfully new is the way that he can summarize so much of these traditions all together. That synthesis that he formed of the biblical and the classical is done in a new and different way, to be sure. You know, one cliche would be to say that he does with Virgil and a whole tradition of classical learning what, let's say, Thomas Aquinas does with Aristotle. One way of taking a look at it would be that he manages to also be acutely aware of all of the tendencies in his own time in philosophy and theology, so that it's Thomas, but it's also Bonaventure. It's all of this that he's able to sort of bring together and to do it in the vernacular. So that for all of those reasons, it's a monstrous achievement, and it's a monstrous new achievement from the point of view if nothing like that had been accomplished. But the various parts were sort of there for Dante to come along and mess with.
In defense of the principle of human progress, without which none of us would be here, I think there is a kind of continuity between the High Middle Ages and the Renaissance. But between those two things, you had a little Dark Age, in which the population of Europe collapsed by 1/3 or a half, which the Renaissance, in a kind of way, was a response to that. And I think that if you look at the population curve and the way it began to explode during the time of the Renaissance, and the age of discovery and the explosion in science and a greater understanding of the physical universe, you can say that the Renaissance stands on the shoulders of the high mark of the Middle Ages. But surpasses
it surpasses it in certain ways. I mean, I think it's really important, from my understanding anyway, not to equate scientific progress, or not to make scientific progress as the only benchmark of progress. And it seems to me that if you look at it from that point of view, sure, but there are a number of different perspectives from which it seems to me you could look at it as a regress as well. In other words, I'm not sure to what extent our view depends to a certain extent on what we understand to be notions of progress, some of which I think are still open to question. I don't know how Bill would want to respond to that.
Yeah, I think that one of the difficulties is that we obviously have the job, historians have the job of cutting history up in pieces. And, a question is, where do you draw the line? And it's very difficult. If you look at books on the Middle Ages and ask where do they end, you get some very interesting answers, but the answers are almost always based on what do you think is important. 1492 is a good date because it's the beginning of something new. 1453 is a very big date. The end of the 100 Years' War, the fall of Constantinople. 1517 is a good date if you see the essence of the Middle Ages being a unified Catholic, Christian, at least Western Europe. Then 1517 is a better divider than when Leonardo Bruni lived or when Michelangelo painted something or whatever it might be. So ultimately, the way we carve up things, as we inevitably do and must, is often based on how we value certain things. If you ask how you divide up European history today in America, if you have 4 European historians in a history department, I guarantee these are the 4 fields you have: ancient, medieval, early modern, and modern. Now, the most interesting of those, of course, is the distinction made fairly recently between early modern and modern. Okay, in the old days, modern meant start with the Renaissance, and we still live in that era. But as Ron said, there's some nasty little things about the 15th and 16th century that make us uncomfortable. How about the rise of witchcraft, the revival of slavery in Western Europe, partly coming out of the demographics of the Black Death, and the fact that really the Renaissance didn't push forward science very much. The scientific revolution occurred in the 17th and 18th centuries. And so, in a sense, the idea of early modern Europe is a way to differentiate ourselves from that very period because it has those very unmodern things in it. But it all reminds us of the fact that what we have with various periods of history are constructions that we create primarily to be useful and primarily to, in a sense, express our views of the relative values of different elements of society. It's a necessary thing that we do, and by definition, periodizing is misleading. And we have to deal with both of them. The important thing is to be sophisticated enough to know those two things. Periodization is necessary, and periodization is to some extent convention or fiction or whatever else we might want to call it. I think as long as we recognize the limits of labels and dating things by century. I mean, I would say to my students, I grew up in Indiana in the 60s. In Indiana, the 60s were not the 60s. The 70s were the 60s. But, you know, we got to be very careful about what we mean. Except for a couple parts where they haven't arrived yet, but that's another point.
Yeah.
That's another story.
Yeah. I have a 1492 story which might be worth mentioning in this context. I was doing a Dante Seminar for high school teachers a couple of years ago in Italy. And as you can imagine, you've got 15 places, you've got the government paying, and you've got Italy and Dante. Lots of people apply. You're allowed to take 15, maybe 150 had applied for this seminar. So the people who were accepted were very sharp and very sophisticated. And we're going through Dante, and we're sort of getting toward the end of Purgatory, and one of the people said, wait a minute, this part of Purgatory only makes sense if the earth is round. And I said, that's absolutely right. So also does all of Inferno, all of Purgatorio, and all of Paradiso only make sense if the earth is round. And she said, but people in Dante's time thought that the earth was flat. And I said, no, people in Babylonia knew that the earth was round. The Greeks knew that the earth was round. The Romans knew that the earth was round. People in the Middle Ages knew that the earth was round. People in the Renaissance knew the earth was round. The only people who didn't know the earth was round were the people who made up the textbooks in the 1950s. Okay? And feel free to use that one. Okay? It seems to me that it's that kind of unthinking acceptance of, I mean, one of the reasons why it's really important to read Dante is one of the same reasons why it's important to read primary texts. They give you a better idea of what folks thought than reading what secondary texts say about them. And it's really quite liberating to see examples that overthrow the cliches and wonder whether the folks who have the cliches are simply mouthing it because somebody else said it before them. Again, nothing like primary texts for a kind of liberation from all of that. And so, again, I think that that's, since this is, if we're sounding sort of excessively rabid about this, it's largely because we're faced with it all the time. The kind of, you teach the Middle Ages, now isn't that when people still lived in caves mentality is not nearly as prevalent as it once might have been, but there are a bunch of unstated assumptions that are still hanging around among some very sophisticated and educated people.
My favorite one-liner is, people were dirty in the Renaissance too. Okay. You hear all the time. I teach a course in the Middle Ages, I teach a course in the Renaissance, and as the beginning essay each semester, I have students go out and interview sort of folks on the street. You know, what do you think of when you hear the word medieval, or whatever? What do you think of when you hear the word Renaissance? For medieval, 90% of the people they interview say people sort of were dirty then. And the implication is they all started taking baths in the Renaissance. Believe me, Florence stunk both times. It really did. A lot of body odor, and so on. That's always sort of my reminder that there's sort of this implicit notion that people sort of bathing regularly in the Renaissance. That is, I want to point out, not so, and it was not so for a long time after the Renaissance either. That's worth pointing out. This actually is, believe it or not, a clever transition into where we want to go a little bit now. And that is, let me throw out a problem that I, as a historian, am particularly concerned with. But it certainly transcends the discipline of history to the kind of stuff we're doing. The great majority of our students are not going to be Dante scholars. They're not going to be college professors. They're not going to be high school teachers. They are going to be lawyers and doctors and business people and computer whatevers and firemen and policemen for that matter. And therefore, we obviously ask the broad question, why do they read these old books? And what might be of value to them? Well, we can pretty easily dismiss that, well, it'll give you more information for the next test you take, or it makes good cocktail party conversation with people who went to Yale. Okay, those are not sufficient reasons why you should read Plato or Dante or Shakespeare or any of those things. Ultimately, what most of our students, what most readers, and I assume what most of you, you're not passing any tests, are looking for is, in reading this, not only do I find a certain pleasure, but I also find it to be useful in some ways. And the question, though, is a tough one. How do we make a text written more than 700 years ago, in a place far away, in a foreign language, in a set of political circumstances that, at least in a literal way, are radically different than our own? How do we make that book useful and applicable to us? It seems to me that in a lot of ways, in universities, and beyond as well, are a couple different mistakes that are made. One mistake, and God knows this is a professorial mistake, and I think we all fall into it a little bit, is being so concerned with getting the facts right, the context right. Every professor has at some point said, I've heard Herzman say something like this, I know I've said it, you're not going to understand Dante at all unless, and then you list a long list of things. You've read these 12 books, or you can read it in the original, or fill in the blank. And of course, if we take that seriously and literally, it means almost nobody, except perhaps ourselves, of course, will really be able to understand and make use of it. And ultimately, I think with some of our colleagues, perhaps we would say there are some myopic academics, hard to admit. We've lived among them for 40 years, we know better. But at any rate, it becomes a series of footnotes, a series of details, and ultimately it becomes a kind of antiquarian pursuit. And it's okay. I mean, there are people who collect, funny little doodads, and that's a great thing as a source of pleasure, whether those doodads are useful or whether they gain any useful perspectives on the world. Occupies time, better than playing video games, better than watching, wrestling on television. That I collect, gaslights from the 19th century or whatever. But we also understand it's a kind of antiquarian pursuit. The other situation is where people don't do the homework at all. And they pull ideas and phrases out of context. They assume words mean exactly then what they mean now and whatever. And they're so busy in making Dante or any other classical, in the broad sense of the word, classical author useful, that in fact what they're really doing is simply using that author as a way of getting some clout for their own ideas. That Dante becomes an extension of them or any other author. And therefore, I think what we want to suggest is that it's important for talking to young people and to all of you and to ourselves ultimately to find ways in which Dante is a valuable resource and guide, not just an entertainment, however serious and profound an entertainment he is, but also the fact that in order to do that, you've got to do the homework first. That one does need a sense of that historical context. One does need a sense of the worldview that Dante occupied in order that we not take leaps that will lead us into sort of meaningless generality or, again, simply propagating our own views by using somebody else as our source. And so I think we're interested in that dialogue between past and present, where we believe in the scholarship that people do, including we ourselves. We've added certainly some fairly uninteresting articles to the world body of material.
Well, at least some fairly elaborately footnoted articles. I would say that once you go into the hundreds in terms of a footnote, that you've sort of made it fairly inaccessible for most of the world. But there is a kind of value to that, to test your ideas against other experts. I think that the real problem comes when you assume that those other experts should be your major audience, rather than as a way of kind of keeping you honest and keeping you somewhat disciplined. My way of putting it is that the more you learn about Dante's world, the more he's going to have to tell you about yours. But it's an act of faith to get 19-year-olds to do that. And so, of course, having said that, then the job is to make Dante's world interesting so that they can make the application to their own. You know, there's no question that universal concerns emerge out of a reading of the Commedia. The problem, as Bill suggests, is when those concerns emerge too quickly, because then it simply becomes a matter of talking about yourself. And Dante himself wouldn't have all that much use for it. Dante himself, of course, provides a good model for us, because one of the things that we've implicitly suggested is that to create his own world, Dante is in continuous dialogue both with his biblical past and with his classical past, going into the past not because he's an antiquarian, but because he wants to take all of this stuff and use that to talk about what's important to himself and his own time. The more he can do that, the more he doesn't have to start from scratch, the more he can build on what's already there, the more he can start at a sophisticated level and move higher. So that our job, I guess, is to do a little bit with Dante what Dante has provided us a model for in dealing with his own predecessors.
I would argue, by the way, that Dante's model for doing that is not so much a scholarly model. I would argue it's a prophetic model. If we, you know, when we hear the word prophet, this is not the audience I need to say this to, but anyway, we hear the word prophet, very often people think of reading tea leaves, or, you know, Madame Sarah reading your palm, or whatever it might be. But the more Ron and I, because we both teach courses on the Bible, the more we read the prophetic tradition, the more we learn about that, and the more we bring it back to Dante, I think what we realize is how profoundly Dante understood the prophetic tradition. Prophetic tradition is not about reading tea leaves. It seems to me that if you believe in this Christian God, this God of Abraham, this God of Judeo-Christian God, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, it's a God who reveals God's self through history. And therefore, if you know the past, if you have understood the past, and if you are a careful observer of the present, you can say some pretty good things, some pretty smart things about the future. That in the prophetic tradition, their forward-lookingness is not separated from their careful analysis of the present and their deeply rootedness in the Hebrew tradition, both oral and written tradition, as it turns out. And therefore, that prophetic stance that Dante will take, that forward-lookingness that he will take, is not so much the work of the scholar. It is adapting that prophetic tradition and that prophetic voice to his own time and to his own person. And when you read Isaiah, I mean, essentially what Isaiah says is, in the past, when people have turned away from God, God has done this. At present, we're turning away from God. Okay? Therefore, we're not guessing anymore. This is not tea leaf. Therefore, God has a track record of when people have turned away from God, and therefore we can look at the whole of time. Dante lives in a worldview that emphasizes the wholeness of time, as we suggested with this very medieval view of biblical interpretation. And so I think this bringing things together is, although certainly in part a work of scholarship for Dante and for us, it's also having some vision and some voice and being rooted in the very kind of God that the Hebrew God uniquely is among all the gods of antiquity and whatever.
I would say there's also a model emerging from the classical tradition as that was reinterpreted through the Middle Ages, which suggests that the way you learn things is not the scholarly model as that's understood, but rather through dialogue. In other words, it seems to me that the Socratic model, which is imitated in a certain way in the scholastic method of doing questions and answers, is to bring as many different sources to bear on an issue as possible and begin to sort through in that, as if to say it is primarily a communal enterprise. And Dante wants to extend that community in space and time by bringing together as many different sources who have dealt intelligently on this as possible, which is why he is so synthetic in the way that he combines the classical past and the biblical past. It seems that if there's anything at all to what we've said, it might even make a little bit of sense for us to talk about this in somewhat more personal terms and say something about how we have experienced various kinds of dialogue in our own teaching and writing about Dante, because it seems to me, at least in my case, and I don't know whether Bill would say the same thing, that at least as far as Dante is concerned, the stuff that I've actually put in print that I'm least ashamed of, the stuff that I wouldn't mind showing to somebody else and saying, hey, what do you think of this, has been stuff that has emerged from and gone back into my teaching, and that has emerged in various of the dialogues that we conduct. One of the reasons why we love coming to places like this is, of course, we get a different audience. It's just very different to do Dante in front of you folks and do Dante in front of 18-year-olds or do Dante in front of the 14-year-olds when we go and visit the classes of teachers that we've taught who are trying to do Dante in their own schools. And the kind of questions that emerge turn out to be different, but they cause us to come back into the same text and think about that in new and meaningful ways. And for both of us, I think that this was really brought home in its most forceful form relatively early on in our career together. In 1975, we taught our first Dante class together. In 1980, we taught what is probably our most unusual and certainly most interesting Dante course.
It was in a slammer. We, through a very weird set of circumstances, we were invited to teach a Dante course, the entire Commedia, in Attica prison. All of you are old enough to remember the Attica riot of 1971. This was less than a decade after that, and one of the reforms that came temporarily, I might add, out of the Attica riot was finding ways to encourage both private and public institutions to establish college courses and even college degree programs inside the, what are now called correctional facilities, we don't have prisons anymore, in New York State. And we lived 32 miles from Attica. And a friend of ours was the dean of a community college who ran a degree program inside Attica and wanted us to teach for him. So we said, okay, we'll do sort of a Western Civ, World Lit kind of combo. We've done that before. He said, no, we can hire other people to do that. Do something only you can do. Do a Dante course. Well, that seemed ridiculous. So, of course, we did.
Yeah.
Now, before you ever get to the classroom, as you can imagine, is not half the fun in a maximum security prison. We went for our training in August. That's when all the guys are out working out without shirts on outside, I might add. And we were given a
really happened. We're not smart enough to make this up.
We were given a course on how to defend ourselves. Okay? Now, let me just tell you, this involved squeezing genitals and cramming people's nose bones into their skulls and puncturing their brains. Those were the two things.
Mind you, they didn't give any instructions in this. They just simply said, that's what you should do if you're ever attacked.
If you're ever grabbed from behind, these are your two options.
Yeah,
I thought yelling help was good.
Yeah, by people whose biceps were bigger than my chest, I thought that was really very funny. It did nothing to inspire confidence.
Yeah,
Neither.
The guy who was giving us a lesson said, now what I really would like to show you is a film we took in Auburn prison where they actually took a teacher captive and hanged him in the meat locker. I was sort of glad they didn't have that video myself. But anyway, we start teaching Dante in Attica. And we meet our, by the way, in Attica, it's maximum security. A third of the inmates on average have taken a life. Okay, this is a crowd. So we have this interesting crowd of students, and there are many stories to tell, but in the third week, we'd done some background stuff, and we got to Inferno 5. We were doing Paolo and Francesca, which plays really well in the slammer, I might add. And we were sort of going on, sort of doing our thing. We were explaining how, as Ron said earlier today, Francesca blames the book, she blames love, she blames everything but herself. We're going on and taking a look at this and showing them in the text very carefully how this is happening. And a hand shoots up from a guy who was in for 25 years to life for murder. Okay, a Native American, as it turns out. He's out now, by the way, I'm happy to report. And he puts up his hand.
And he says, that's me. He said, that's why I'm here. Well, at that moment, we realized we had a whole lot more to learn from them than they had to learn from us. And so here was a very interesting situation where people often did not have much by way of formal education before they came to the class. one of the things that was extraordinarily interesting is that they put the course on the books, and then they went around sort of pumping up the course among the people who might take it by saying, hey, we got these hotshots coming in, they're not part of your normal faculty, they're going to give you a really good course, take it. So they did, but they took it on faith because we found out when we got there for the first class that most of them had never heard the word Dante before. They didn't know who he was, why he's important, or why anybody should study him. It was up to us to prove it to them. But by the same token, it was really wonderful because they had no prepackaged expectations. They didn't know whether they were supposed to bow down. Oftentimes, my difficulty, I teach a Shakespeare course that's required for our English majors, and people say, well, okay, I'm supposed to kiss Shakespeare's butt, not me. I'm going to show you that he's not as good as he's supposed to be. Well, there was nothing of that. There was nothing of anything. So what we did in the beginning was talk about Dante as exile, talk about Dante's condition of exile as being similar to their own, and then sort of saying, okay, now do you think he's worth talking about? And from that point on, even without a great deal of formal education, they were able to go to the text and find things that were as piercing as the example that Tom Skye gave us that second week. And so we realized that it was possible to do all of this stuff without huge amounts of footnotes, that it was our job to try and get to the meat of things and to sort of work from the inside out rather than suggest, well, here are the 14 things you need to know before you can make this canto come alive for you. So that it is this wonderful dialogue between, figuring out what needs to be said beforehand and figuring out what the guts of the issue is that we're trying to get to, and having those two things come together somehow.
Needless to say, there were some surprising and occasionally comic moments in all of this. A couple that I remember was, one of the things the inmates were really interested in is how far down in hell they would be for committing their particular crime. And I remember we had this guy who was incensed because he was farther down than most of the other people there. He was a pimp. And Dante puts pimps among the fraudulent and farther down than the murderers. And he was just angry at hell. In fact, his great line was, I don't like it here. There's some bad people here. My other most comic moment, perhaps, was one of the inmates came up and said, would you like to have the paper typed? And we said, well, of course, but we didn't think we had access to typewriters. And he said, well, actually, I do, because I'm the secretary for the college program. And just to make conversation, I said, what kind of typewriter do you have here? He said, have an IBM Selectric, which was a hot deal then. And I said, boy, I wish I had an IBM Selectric. He said, I wish you'd have known me before. I had a whole truckload of them. Had its moments.
Another thing that was extraordinarily interesting about the experience is that they were the most grade-conscious group that we've ever had. You would think that the opposite was true, especially with people who were there for a long time. And we had people who clearly were lifers, for whom, if parole was a possibility, it wasn't until the far, far distant future. And they were obsessed with grades. And we tried to kind of figure this out. And one thing that we came up with, and I think there's some validity to it, is that this was one of the few things that they had really going for them in their life. And so they needed some kind of validation of that. It was also interesting once we caught on to that because we realized that they took us very seriously. In fact, the thing that struck us is that if there ever was any hanky-panky that was going on, we would be much, much safer with our students than with the guards. And there was another kind of interesting tension going on there that we discovered in a fairly comic way. I'm actually quite well behaved today in that I've kept my shoes on. I was well known in those days for teaching in my stocking and sometimes unstocking bare feet. somehow I just sort of felt more comfortable about it. Maybe it was because growing up in Brooklyn, you didn't get all that much chance to sort of run around in the fields barefoot. But for whatever reason, I would do my teaching barefoot. And one day, we're sitting there with our inmates. We're going through a canto, slowly, carefully, and a guard comes in, and the guard says, "Are you Cook or Herzman?" And I thought, this is probably not the time to screw around, so I said, "I'm Cook." No. And he said, "The lieutenant wants to see you." So I got up, I walked out, and they take me to this stairwell, and the lieutenant is there, and I thought, oh my goodness, I've read about stuff like this. You know, I'm never going to be heard from again, and you know, what kind of story is Bill going to have to tell my wife when we get home? The lieutenant said to me, "We don't take our shoes off in the classroom. It sets a bad example for the men." So again, that thought went through my mind. 1/3 of them have taken a life. 70% are there for a violent crime. And you could say, it all happened when I saw somebody barefoot. I couldn't live with that anymore. Well, I came back to class. They all knew what was going on. They thought it was a riot. But then when they got serious, they said, you know, that lieutenant, he's actually somebody who is, unlike most of the guards here, and unlike most of the structure here, is actually in favor of the inmate education program. Most of the people here would rather see it, you know, out of a kind of envy, would rather see it go down the tubes because we're getting a free college education and they can't have it. But his way of dealing with things was to sort of say, you know, there's a right way and a wrong way, and clearly doing it barefoot was not the right way. All of that meant that there was a kind of solidarity in the classroom. We also knew that it was really crazy to try and enforce some of the rules. You're not really supposed to smoke in the classroom, but it wasn't just because they had 56-inch biceps that we wanted to say, no smoking now. It was because all of a sudden when they knew that they had a certain amount of control over what went on, they were so amazingly damn serious in the way that they took the material. They would come up to us at the beginning of a class and say, I read this canto 14 times and I'm still having trouble with, and they'd point to a line, and we realized that what they meant was that they read the canto 14 times. And all of a sudden they were there looking at this stuff with a degree of intensity that it would be hard to convey to you. The best testimony of that for me is that at the final exam after the course, the second time we went through it, I'm standing by the water fountain at break time, and a guy who is taking a drink sort of looks up and says to me, when I read this poem, it's like I'm out of here. And you know, I barely was able to contain the tears, but what it said to me is that, okay, the poem has proved itself to a very tough audience. If we are able to do it here, then we really don't have any excuse for not doing it anywhere. So in a sense, since that time, we've become, have Dante, will travel. Anybody who wants us to come and talk to Dante, it doesn't matter, we go. I mean, it's almost now a kind of Pavlovian response. But the good news in all of that is that we've never come back from a place saying, well, you know, that was a mistake, or they didn't get it. It's gettable, and it's gettable to all kinds of people. The problem with academia is that we've kind of convinced ourselves that it's only gettable if you have the footnotes, rather than seeing the footnotes as a way to help us find what we need to say to get folks into the poem. And that's different depending on whether you're dealing with 14-year-olds. May I suggest Sex and Violence helps a lot with that crowd. But you know, the concerns are so real and so relevant that it seems to me that it's our fault, not Dante's, if we don't get through.
By and large, I think if you surveyed our undergraduates, or most undergraduates, who've read the whole poem, my guess is that the winning canticle in popularity will be Inferno. Again, it's got sex and violence, lots of both, and some really filthy ones. Okay, what a formula for success. We've done this for Trappist monks. We have the Abbey of the Genesee 4 miles from where we live, and we've known the monks for all of our time in Geneseo. And their favorite part is Paradiso. And again, I suppose that's not terribly surprising, since they've been working pretty hard to get there. For the inmates, their favorite part was Purgatory. And, one of the things we always say to our students is, hell's forever and heaven's forever and Purgatory isn't. In Purgatory, things change. In Purgatory, you could argue that what it is a systematic examination of the means of moral improvement. And I can remember asking inmates, saying, why did you sign up for this rather than Accounting 101 or Auto Mechanics 101? And they said, well, because we need to get better. And because when we get out, we don't want to end up back here again. We know that what we need is moral improvement. And of course, Purgatory really is a pretty careful and systematic analysis of a means of moral improvement and a set of skills you need, essentially, to have that moral improvement, skills of discipline and focus and whatever. People are constantly being scolded in Purgatory for sort of taking their eyes off the ball, we might say. And so it was interesting because, in a sense, the very thing that fascinates our undergraduates with Inferno wasn't terribly interesting to the inmates in a prison. They've lived a lot of those things, and they aren't funny. We had a student come up to us and say, in talking about some of the punishments in Inferno, he said, I was a torturer in the Dominican Republic for Trujillo. Okay? Been there, done that. I mean, no 19-year-old says that. Been there, done that. We had a guy come up and said, my mother was a prostitute. I grew up changing the sheets in her bed between tricks. Okay, there's not a lot in Inferno that's going to shock him.
We also, when we were in Purgatorio, one of the things that Dante does at the very beginning is have a kind of interesting dialogue on the possibility of salvation at the last minute. And there are a lot of examples of deathbed conversions, people who you would expect by every measure to be in hell who turn out to have repented at the last minute and who are on their way to heaven, who are in a way actually in heaven. And one of the things that we mention when we're talking about that is a very interesting way of retrofitting the Inferno, because it means that the folks who are in Inferno are people who were obstinate up to their last days, up to their last time, that they had a chance which they didn't take. And so we were sort of busy making that point, and somebody raised his hand and says, I'm just not sure about this stuff about, people are going to say anything. And we tried to say, yeah, but it's not what you say, it's really a kind of interior disposition. You're not able to scam God and so on. He said, well, I've seen a lot of people die, and he was sort of suggesting, he said, they'll say anything. It was kind of like we didn't have a comeback for that one. He was talking about deaths that were fairly violent, it seems to me, pretty sure. And the way that we kind of, I'm going to put this, I don't want to make it sound too apocalyptic here, but what we got out of that experience was that the stuff that's in here really does matter, and that all of a sudden it's our job to make it matter, because if it doesn't, it ain't our fault. I mean, it ain't Dante's fault. If we're not able to connect the text with an audience, it's because we're doing something wrong. And for us, the Traveling Dante Show is a lot about finding new things from one audience that we can take for another. That the stuff you say is going to help us the next time that we teach this course to our Geneseo students, and vice versa.
There's one big thing the monks and the inmates had in common. And that is they both not only asked, but persisted in asking a question that our undergraduates almost never asked. Our undergraduates almost never asked was Dante a moral man? Because it's so easy to treat this as an intellectual feat. Boy, this guy read more books than anybody. This guy would have gotten a straighter A than any A anybody could have ever gotten in history for creative writing. Is sort of a mentality they often work with. These guys, the monks and the inmates, want to know, is this simply a product of his brain, or does he mean it?
Sure.
Is this a personal story, or is this something where he goes out and gets his agent and sells it? What is this for, and to what extent should I take it seriously if Dante doesn't mean it? If Dante's simply doing this as a kind of intellectual exercise? And both the monks and the inmates are very nervous about accepting its greatness if they don't know something about the fact that this guy really believed this stuff and really meant it.
The person who asked us that question in the monastery was, appropriately enough, named Father Thomas Aquinas. And I kid you not, I'm not good enough to make this stuff up. And his way of formulating it was, do you think Dante is a saint? And it hadn't been put to me that starkly, but it was sort of nice that I didn't have too much time to think about it. I had to kind of go with the gut reaction that was the product of all of my years of reading Dante up to that time. And my answer was, yes, I do. And so now we have to get busy with the business of seeing that he gets canonized. But the version of that was present in Attica was that we had to convince them that Dante was not just a very clever snake oil salesman. And so what we did was talk about the facts of his exile and say, well, we can't really prove it to you the first time out, but if you trust us just a bit, maybe you can come to that conclusion for yourself. But again, in their reading of the Commedia, they were really obsessed with whether or not Dante was a good man, which was correlative to them to the question of whether or not Dante is telling the truth. That a friend of ours who has taught a philosophy course in another nearby prison said that they finally decided that the best definition of philosophy that they could come up with for their purposes was philosophy is what tells you, what enables you to see who's lying to you. And it seems to me that at least if you're in their position, and maybe in all of our positions, that's an extraordinarily important skill to have. Well, they kind of decided that Dante was not lying to them. And once that decision was made, what was so meaningful and moving to us was the energy that they put into, to sort of keep going at it, to keep trying to discover what was there. And so it seems to me that more than we knew at the time, that really set us in a particular direction.
By the way, I think one of the tools that we use as a way of trying to help students understand that is, and let me start with something that happened a couple years before. I had a postdoctoral year at Harvard, and I was in a seminar with a very, very distinguished medieval historian named David Hurley. He was president of the Medieval Academy and president of the American Historical Association, alas died too young. But at any rate, David Hurley was a brilliant medievalist, one of the real seminal medievalists of the 20th century. And somehow or other we get talking about Inferno one day in the seminar I was part of. And we were talking about the Paolo and Francesca canto, Canto 5, that I think probably you're all familiar with, where Dante sort of swoons at the end. And David Hurley, he said to me, said to the group really, boy, that Dante, meaning the poet now, not the pilgrim, okay, the guy that wrote the poem, he sure recognized that Francesca sort of got a bad break, didn't he? And I said, no, you got to make this distinction between the guy who writes the poem and the guy who's the character who's, dumb as anything in Canto 5. We can't take the response of Dante the Pilgrim to be what Dante the poet wants us to understand about the meaning of this story. He gets it all wrong. And, you go on with that, and in Canto 10, he starts fighting back with Farinata in exactly the same language that Farinata was, my family can beat up your family. No, my family can beat up your family is Dante's response, essentially. And, I kept emphasizing to him something that Ron and I had already taught in our own class, and it reminded me how pervasive that notion is of that failure to separate Dante the Pilgrim from Dante the poet. Once you do that, once you see that Dante the poet is condemning that earlier life and looking at that earlier life very critically and putting himself out there as a guy not to be envied, not to be imitated, but a guy in the sense to be pitied for how incredibly stupid he was, then it becomes easier for people to see the sort of sincerity and the sort of honesty with which Dante's doing. It's not a self-promotion job. If it is, you don't start it that way. And that particular distinction, which is one, again, that has to be taught very often at the beginning with new readers. But that's one of those footnotes you do provide that really does empower people then to read the poem in a certain way.
But notice the moral that can be drawn if you stretch that a little further. David Hurley, again, one of the most brilliant medievalists of the 20th century, didn't get it. Tom Skye Felon did. That we're going along reading exactly the same canto, and he says, what she's doing here, she's putting the blame on somebody else. Well, in fact, that simple line characterizes what every single sinner that Dante encounters in the Inferno does. Refusal to accept blame, finding somebody else to put the blame on, and sort of going about your business. He saw that much more perceptively and much more quickly than one of the eminent scholars, a person from whom Bill certainly and me sort of secondarily have learned a lot from. And again, it means that one shouldn't have to worry. How do I want to put this in terms of, let's say, the schools? You don't need to be an AP student to do Dante. You don't need to be gifted and talented. You don't need to be somebody who is on the fast track. And in many ways, the outcasts and the misfits are going to get some of this stuff more quickly than the people who are academically more respectable.
I used to have a colleague in my department, Harvard PhD, Rhodes Scholar. And when we were debating curriculum and talking about setting up a curriculum that included students reading Plato and Dante and Augustine and whatever, his response was, if you can't read the Odyssey in Greek, what's the value of reading it? And of course, that kind of attitude, which is simply an expansion of that attitude, you've got to know all the footnotes and whatever for able to do. Basically what it says is, again, only I and a very rare handful of people can or should, with any profit, read these books. And it seems to me that the lesson we learned from Attica, much more than from any other experience we've had, is that in a sense, in this sense, the world's a democracy. That everybody can benefit from this book and presumably other books as well. Our experience has been with this one. And that therefore to deprive anybody of that for whatever reasons or categories you put them in is really to take on sort of the worst qualities of a kind of snobbery that academics, God knows, and other people in the world can be good at. And it was an important lesson for us because you do, no matter what your SAT scores are in your institution, you always have some few people that don't seem to get it, that don't write good papers. And you always have a few people where you wonder what they're doing in college and how they slip through the process. And what this does is remind you that even though there are some people who either willfully or for some other reason just don't get it at all, it really is an accessible text if you present it in a way that can make sense with the right footnotes and a few footnotes, and then let them go at the text. Dante's much better than Musa. Musa writes footnotes, Dante writes poetry. Let him go to Dante. And that works just about every time.
This, by the way, would be another lesson that Dante got from the Bible. Augustine famously, and I suppose lots of other biblical exegetes have said the same thing, that the thing that separates the Bible from all other texts is that it is a work that is accessible at some level to anybody, but in its profoundest depths, none of us is ever going to reach fully. And what Augustine says about the Bible works, I think, in terms of Dante as well. He's ready for us at any level, but of course, those of us who have been sort of fanatical reading him over the years know that the reason we want to get back to another time is that there are all of these new mysteries that open up that we're not even close to fathoming at Dante's level. That Dante's one of the very, very, very rare authors who, no matter what we do, we tend to underestimate rather than overestimate because he is so profound. And so the very same thing let me put it another way. A really cool thing about folks who are fanatical teachers of Dante is that it's something that you're simply not capable of getting tired of. I have never said, oh God, I got to go off and do another Dante lecture. It seems to me that there are very few people that you can say that about. And so your job is to kind of pass that along some way.
Why don't we open this up for, again, some discussion? If the questions and comments don't take us to our next break, we can begin our last part, which is going to be to look at a couple cantos. But let's see how we go with this.
Can you say something about the publishing history of the book? How it was received and how it's been received over time?
Well, first thing to say about it is that the early manuscripts of the Commedia, we don't have anything like an autograph from Dante's own hand. We have stuff from within a couple of years of his lifetime, and those early editions, those early manuscripts, come complete with footnotes, which is to say that the idea of annotating Dante is not something that moderns do to kind of bridge the gap between Dante's time and our own. It was recognized right from the get-go, right from the outset, that this was a learned poem that put particular demands on its readers. And so people were, one of the early commentators, for example, is Dante's own son. And so that this tradition of commentary grows up and grows along with the poem itself. And it's, Bill said, it's a very kind of interesting relationship between the two. Bill put it quite right when he said that Dante is better than Musa, that you want the poem first, but the notes secondarily, but the notes are always necessary to some degree or other. And it's also a very interesting fact in terms of our own situation now, that we are in a unique position to retrieve that publication history, because thanks to the miracles of modern technology, lest you think that we are, simply medieval Luddites, it's kind of interesting that online is a resource that has taken all of the major commentaries of the Divine Comedy and made them available. Because Dante is divided into cantos and verses, it becomes very easy to enter the commentary by canto and verse. So let's say that you wanted to find out what all of the people who have written significantly in the commentary tradition said about the line when Paolo and when Francesca is telling the story, that day we read no further. So you type in Inferno 5 line, something or other, and you get 85 different screens from Pietro da Dante through Mark Musa and beyond. And in looking at that, not only do you have this extraordinary resource for understanding Dante at your disposal, you have an extraordinary resource for understanding how the different centuries have understood Dante. And so through that, you can see something of the way in which Dante was received in the Renaissance, sort of not quite all that much interest in the Enlightenment, then all of a sudden the poster child for the Risorgimento, and then the great period of 20th century scholarship. You can see something like Dante's reception history throughout history simply by looking at the commentary tradition. So that would be one thing that I would say about the publication history of the poem. And then, of course, you would have to deal with the way in which it was spread to other European vernaculars, the fact that there was a Latin translation made at some point. How many of you have read the Dante Club? One of the things that I think is really neat about that book is that it gets it right in terms of the origins of the Dante Society of America and Dante's entrance into mainstream American culture through the work of Longfellow and the other folks who are part of that circle. I just saw in an ad the other day that Longfellow's edition of the Inferno is now available, edited by Matthew Pearl himself, the author of the Dante Club. And so Dante has, in a sense, become mainstream in American culture thanks to the crowd that hung around in Harvard with James Russell Lowell and Longfellow and Holmes and those folks. So that to follow that is an interesting story. To follow a kind of resurgence in Dante interest because he was so interesting to Eliot. All kinds of people who wanted to figure out what T.S. Eliot was all about went back to Dante, and then all of a sudden they said, hey, wait a minute, let's stay with Dante for a while. Nothing wrong with Eliot, but so you know, it's a long and interesting and complicated history.
Certainly in Florence, in the decades after Dante's death, a number of things happened. Remember, of course, Dante dies in exile. He's buried in Ravenna. And whatever else we say, there are a lot of Florentines in hell, and Dante not only condemns Florentines, but at one point in Inferno, at the beginning, 25 or 26, I forget, he condemns Florence more generally, all of Florence, you know, that all these thieves down here are yours, and so on and so forth. Well, needless to say, Florentines are at least somewhat ambivalent about this guy. And by the end of the 14th century, they're hiring lecturers to give public lectures on Dante. They are in that great 15th century era when the Florentines keep saying, you know, we're the new Rome. We are to our time what Rome was to the ancient world. Well, by golly, Florence has its own Virgil. That's sort of handy. They've got Dante. On the other hand, Dante, in the eyes of some of the humanists, has a couple things really wrong. One, he writes in Italian, and they continue to have this debate about the vernacular and its appropriateness. But the other is, he's got his politics all wrong. Because for Dante, it's the Roman Empire that was the ideal time, because it was this world government. And the world was relatively at peace. And Julius Caesar was the one who was about to make that happen. And Brutus and Cassius bump him off. And they are working against God. And of course, they're in the two side mouths of Satan at the very bottom of hell. But in the 15th century, Florence said, hey, we're a republic. Rome was a republic. Those were the good old days of Rome. Nasty old emperors came along and destroyed freedom, and we're all about freedom. They weren't very good at practicing it, but they were good talking about it. And we're for freedom, and we're for all those Republican virtues. They even changed their history to prove that they were founded in Republican times. Okay, they just redid their history. And so Dante got that wrong. That, you know, it's not Brutus, this was the noblest Roman of them all, which is sort of a more Renaissance view, but Dante's got Brutus being chewed on in the mouth of Satan. So they had some debates with Dante in the Renaissance. Let me just fast forward to the Risorgimento. That's quite a fast forward to the 19th century. Here's a problem. There are people that want to make Italy a country. Let's start with this. Italy's never been a country. And people don't speak the same language. They certainly don't have the same heritage. Sicily and Sardinia, or for that matter, Rome and Naples and Florence and Venice have very, very different traditions. In fact, by one way of defining language, only 2% of people in Italy spoke Italian in the 19th century. Okay? You ever try to listen to a Sicilian peasant?
Yeah, I think it's up to 10% now.
Yeah, right, something like that. So, at any rate, those who are trying to create an Italy have to go back and prove that the seeds are there. And that this is not something new, but it's something old. And they go back to two guys. They're both Florentines. Dante, largely from the passage we read you in Purgatory 6, and Machiavelli, who in the last chapter of The Prince talks about throwing the barbarians out of Italy. Okay? And Machiavelli and Dante become the two great prophets of and prototypes for an Italian state. And in fact, it's important to remember, Florence, not Rome, was the capital of Italy when Florence became a nation. From 1860 to 1870, Florence was the capital. Well, Machiavelli buried right there in Santa Croce. So what do? You start negotiating with Ravenna, and you build a great big tomb for Dante, which is still in Santa Croce, right across from Galileo. But Dante's not there. They never got Dante back. He's still in exile, and by God, he's going to stay. But it's really interesting to see the role Dante played in the creation of the mythology and then the reality of an Italian state. And so he had a kind of usefulness beyond his interest as a literary or religious figure, especially to the leaders of Risorgimento. The intellectual creators of Italy in the 19th century depended on those twin pillars of those Florentines, Machiavelli, who spent a while in exile himself, and Dante. The Florence wasn't very good in keeping his prophets.
Yeah. One of the things that's kind of an interesting footnote to that is that at a certain point, a Medici became Pope who thought he would play hardball and told the people in Ravenna, you will send the body of Dante back. Dante buried in the Franciscan church there, they said, yes, Holy Father, and then sort of got back to him and said, whoops, we seem to have lost the body. And it turned out that the body remained lost at least until that papacy was over. And so now the deal that they've worked out is that there's kind of an eternal flame that is fueled with Florentine olive oil. And every September...
Not kidding about
No, stuff that's this serious you can't make up. And it turns out that every September, right before Dante's death day, his anniversary celebration, they send the year's supply of olive oil to put in front of his tomb. And that's about as close as they're going to get. The Ravenna folks are not going to give this one up.
With your amazing perspective of different audiences that you've taught, what do you notice about maybe differences or similarities in the effect of these various audiences to the poetic, genius, aesthetics?
Well, I guess that I would say that it's in proportion to the amount of time that we have to spend on Dante, so that the longer that you can go through individual cantos, what I like to think of as text crawling, the easier it is to see those poetic effects in action, that you could kind of concentrate on individual similes and then see how they're related, let's say, so that a lot of Dante's extraordinary verbal agility is something that won't strike people immediately if you're looking at it in translation, but will if you do it slowly over a longer period of time. And so I would say that that's sort of the biggest determining factor there. It seems to me that it's tough because we don't have the virtue of teaching it in the original. I have no doubt that high school students would also be able to see some of that. But for me, for example, in the seminars that I do in the summer, the high school teachers, many of them are people whose Italian is quite good. A couple summers ago, I had a bunch of people who had lived in Italy for quite a long time who were fluent in Italian, and obviously they were the ones who were not only able to see some of the poetic genius, but were able to kind of convey that to the rest of the seminar. But it has a lot to do with having the leisure to be able to kind of go through it pretty slowly. One of the reasons why I'm kind of been urging everybody to get the tapes of the Italian is that just listening to the Italian, even if you weren't following it along, you realize that you're dealing with a verbal artist of the absolute highest quality. So I think that for mostly American audiences, it comes slowly, but it does come.
Please.
The youngest people you talked to or lectured to, I know you work with high school teachers. Is there a group yet younger who might be able to absorb some of this, in your opinion?
Oh, absolutely. I know people who have done it to 5th and 6th graders, with 5th and 6th graders. The people who seem to be most successful are the ones who sort of tap into the the kind of mechanics of hell and the levels and all of that kind of stuff. So people construct their own maps and models of hell and can turn it almost into a board game, at the same time one that is a very useful teaching device, because you're able to sort of talk about levels of morality and so on. I find that I've gone into classrooms maybe for me 5th and 6th grade is the youngest that I've seen, but I wouldn't want to rule out earlier stuff. I've actually seen stuff that they've built, and I've said, they get it. On some real level, they get it. It doesn't bother me that if they do it again 7 years later, they'll get a lot more. It seems to me that it's something that really does work, simply because he is such a good storyteller, and a storyteller in a way that younger audiences are familiar with, because, you know, the sort of I know a lot of high school teachers, for example, who have taught Dante and Lord of the Rings courses. In other words, a course on those two, using both the written and the cinematic version of Lord of the Rings. And it seems to me that that provides you with the opportunity to go young. So I'm not sure there is a lower level. You know, I've sort of made jokes with former participants of mine who, you know, I've just had a child and the child is 3 months old. I said, well, okay, what canto are you on now?
I want to get back to the poetry part of this.
Yeah.
I can remember when I was an undergraduate, many years ago, making the commitment that I would try to read this in Italian. And I did. I read the whole thing. I read it in the Bickfords across the street from the 42nd Street Library, and I read it out loud in the back of the room, naturally. But I think it is poetry, and I have some concern that we're losing not only sight of Dante, but we're losing sight of poetry generally in this country.
Mm-hmm.
And unless you hear it, and I know it's very, I find it very difficult. All the contractions were absolutely stupefying.
Mm-hmm.
They're trying to, because it's not even Italian, but you crush all those words together. I don't know how much Italians do. My wife's fluent in Italian. But I think you've got to ask people to stretch a little bit more. I mean, a translation would do
Sure.
it. It gives you the kind of intellectual breadth
Agreed.
or something, but you'll lose the
Agreed.
effective side.
Agreed. The question is, where do you start and how do you get them? To make the commitment that you are suggesting, you have to be hooked first. And I think that it's a, let me put it another way, an awful lot of students that I've had have taken time off and gone to Florence so they can do that, or otherwise said, I've got to learn the language in order to do that. So, you know, it seems to me that there's no question that that's the goal. There's also no question that you're right, that poetry and the ability to read it in any language is a skill that we need to work hard on keeping, because it's something that we're in danger of losing. All I can say is I agree.
One of the things we've done on several occasions when we've taught a whole Dante course is we've said, okay, we're going to be in such and such a place on Wednesday night at 7 o'clock, and we'll just read out loud to each other, and don't worry about your pronunciation and whatever. We just want to start listening to it. I mean, we're not native speakers. We both learned Italian fairly late in life by the standards of when you need to learn a language. You know, we make mistakes. We don't always pronounce everything correctly and whatever. I once had a native speaker who was visiting me, and I was teaching. We were teaching Dante, and we brought the native speaker in, just let him read for a little bit. He was 14 years old at the time. Just let him read, and it was just glorious to hear the sounds. It was the first day of class for our students, and it was wonderful because they heard Dante before they knew anything about it, really. And that was very exciting. But we will get together and have informal reading groups and things of that sort where people have to get over the fear that, oh my God, I'm mispronouncing something. And just sort of let it go. You know, you can do the A, E, I, O, U continental vowel system pretty quickly. You know, you can do when is C, K, and when is C, Ch pretty quickly, and you can get on to reading it. And yes, it won't sound like people named Donatella and Giovanni are reading it, but that's okay. So can Eric and Evelyn read it. And it's important to give them some confidence in doing that. As Ron said, what very often happens then, the next day just saying, I got to know this stuff. This is wonderful. I've got to do this better. Again, the issue is not what the goal is, but recognizing that most students in any undergraduate situation are not going to go off and learn Italian, are not going to be able to read it on their own. And so you really are doing two things. You've got some students who will go on and learn the language and maybe even go to graduate school and study Dante. But the great majority of people are not. You've got to make sure you offer the opportunity for those who want to do more, and you've got to make sure you make the text accessible to everybody who's there that you're in charge of educating. Hand back.
Yeah, I know everyone in this room is teaching this text, but I have a couple questions related to that. It seems some of the things you're talking about are getting at this whole dialogue, and the way in which a dialogue with other people and clarifies and reinforms your teaching. And I'm wondering if you have any insights also into the sort of the habit of reading that way. That is, you know, for those of us who are teaching this, or at the beginning of teaching this, who don't have the careers that you have, and all the experience that you have, how you can read the text more that way, more in tune with those bigger questions. It's sort of my first. And then sort of the second question is, I find another struggle that I have with my students is there can be this tendency to either over-specialize the text and sort of, turn it into these little facts that we know about, I think, or over-generalize and make it kind of banal. Oh, well, that's just sort of, they reduce it to sort of little pat phrases like, ignorance is bliss, or, and so kind of how do you avoid those extremes? Because the sort of starting from their own experience sometimes means they don't want to learn something new.
I start with a line that's out of one of my favorite little books. It's Jaroslav Pelikan's Jefferson Lecture. It's called The Vindication of Tradition. And Pelikan says, he's probably the greatest historian of church dogma in the 20th century. And Pelikan writes that our conversation is much more interesting when we include the dead. And that's right. Most of the most interesting people in the world are dead. We have to start with that. And let me tell you a vignette. Let me give you a personal vignette to lead into that. In 1998, I did the craziest thing I've ever done in my life. I ran for Congress. I ran for the U.S. Congress. I actually came fairly close to winning. That's not the point. You can tell I didn't win, but nevertheless. But what I found is, in that world of press conferences and speeches and candidate forums and all the rest, I wanted to make sure I had some moral center. I wanted to make sure that I had some place where I could bounce things off. And for that, given where we live and whatever, my choice was Frederick Douglass. He lived in Rochester. He's buried in Rochester. And I've taught a course in Frederick Douglass's narrative and whatever. And given the fact that I was operating in the realm of American politics, he was my guy. I was sort of playing what would Douglass say? What would Douglass do if he were confronted with the situation? And this will sound silly. Please don't have me arrested. Okay? I would go to the graveyard where Douglass is, and I would sit there and chat with him. Now, I knew I was both talking as Douglass and talking as me. I knew that. But I was trying very hard to listen to the Frederick Douglass I knew through the slave narrative. I was trying to listen to him very hard and try to figure out what kind of response would have made sense to him. Obviously, I'm playing games. Obviously, I am trying to take somebody who lived in the 19th century and adapt them to the end of the 20th century, and recognizing what all the barriers are. And I found that, again, don't have me sent away. I found that very useful. He provided a kind of center for me because I did have, not quite in a literal way, obviously, a dialogue with Frederick Douglass. And that was very important to me because you come along, and believe me, I know this will strike you as odd in an election year, you have the opportunity to do and say some fairly sleazy things in politics. And I needed somebody to talk to. And the smartest guy I could think of right there, right now, in my neighborhood was Frederick Douglass, and he happened to be dead. And he'd been dead for 103 years. We had some pretty good talks. And the same principle I try to apply to all my students. You want to have, if you're going to have a dialogue with Dante, and you're going to both be you and Dante, you've got to know your Dante pretty well. But once you know that Dante, then you want to start that dialogue. And I actually sort of set it up that way in those very, very, very stark, almost kind of literal terms where I start.
Yeah, a somewhat similar experience for me. I was going through a time when I had a very difficult decision to make, not because one was good and one was bad, but because they were two really good options, and I simply didn't know which way to turn. And I was sort of chatting about this with a colleague of mine as we were driving home one night, and he said, well, have you asked Dante? What would he say about it? And, again, good advice, but even more interesting to me was that I realized that the reason that it was good advice is that implicitly I had been asking my students to make that kind of a commitment to Dante when they studied the text. I think that if you look at it from a particular perspective, that is to say something imbued with moral choice from beginning to end. I mean, Dante himself calls this the drama of the soul's choice, that you can present the text in such a way that people are going to have to respond to what he says. So, a very practical way of doing it is that, as Bill pointed out, using one of the attic examples, very often Dante's system of moral punishments in the Inferno is different from the way that we would usually think about it. I mean, the fact that the pimps are down lower than the murderers, to use Dante's example, it's pretty nice to take that and say to your class, what do you think about that? You know, not necessarily that particular example, but many examples which force them to not only examine what Dante's presuppositions are, but more important, force them to examine their own. And especially since Dante is pretty good at backing up his presuppositions, and you as the teacher will be able to kind of speak for him in that way, you force people to become much more articulate about what they themselves really are committed to. And the very nice thing about doing it in class is that because you're doing it with a text, it's not like you're playing touchy-feely stuff where people have to go in. You know, you can have a moral conversation centered on the text, which becomes the focus of your conversation. And it tells you something about you, and it tells you something about Dante. I mean, it's interesting to us, the many, many, many times that we've taught the Dante course, it's never the same course. And it's not simply because our perceptions have changed, it's because each class comes with a different set of things that they're really concerned about. And it's only maybe halfway through the course that you realize what it is that they're concerned about.
I have to tell you a story. We had a colleague who's now retired named Dante Thomas. You need to know that for the story. Very often, one or the other of us in our individual sections of our Western Humanities course, required of all students, will have students write their own canto, and it's got a lot of rules and regulations. It's not just a free-for-all assignment. But at any rate, I had a student in my office one day, and I'm saying to her, you know, I'm not asking you to do this on your criteria. You need to know what your criteria are. You've got to be Dante. You've got to do this from Dante's point of view. You've got to know his structure of sins. If you're going to put drunk drivers somewhere, the question is not where would you put them, the question is where would Dante put them? Is it a sin of incontinence, a sin of violence, a sin of fraud, and doing all this sort of stuff? I said, you know, you've got to get inside your head, you've got to talk to Dante. Phone rings. I pick it up and say, and I hear who it is, I said, oh, hi Dante, how are you? This student looked at me as if I were the nuttiest person in the world. I think Dante calls me at work during office hours. But so there's always some hazards here.
I actually can one-up him in the sense that I had the same experience from the same phone call, but it was when I had a summer, I was doing the Dante Seminar this time in lovely downtown Geneseo. They were in my living room, the phone rang, and my wife came in and said, it's Dante. And I just sort of smiled, and they sort of, wow, awesome, man. You know? Yeah.
I just had a question. How does Dante's Italian compare with modern Italian?
Less change between Dante and our time than, say, between Chaucer and our time. A lot of the differences have to do with the formal nature of what he's doing, but again, he gets very conversational from time to time as well. The thing you have to know is that modern Italian became modern Italian because of Dante. That if the Tuscan dialect was the one that they were going to use as universal in Italy, then who's the best model of it? It turns out to be Dante himself. So that even more than the way that Shakespeare has shaped English, Dante has shaped Italian. And you know, quite obviously, some of Dante's own coinages don't necessarily last beyond their appearance in, let's say, Paradiso, where he does the most coining. But it seems to me that there's this kind of direct line between Dante's Italian and present day in a way that doesn't exist in any other medieval vernacular writers and the way the language is in the present.
So, for example, when Dante's taught in the public schools in Italy, they read Dante. They don't read a modern version of it, as students in some cases might do with Chaucer, or even now you see their modernizations even of Shakespeare. That doesn't happen with Dante. You don't get the modern Italian version of Dante. I've never seen one. Have you?
I've seen them only in kids' books.
Yeah.
They have, you know, like even 2-volume sets or even 3-volume sets of Dante retold for very young children in Italian. And some of them are really great because they have great illustrations. But it's the only case that I know of where what you have is not the text itself, but a paraphrase of the text. Yeah, we're way over.
Next break.
So yeah, let's take